Steve Harvey had hosted Family Feud for 28 years, and in that time he had developed what he thought was an unshakable ability to maintain his composure through even the most emotional moments. But on a gray November afternoon in 2026, a 33-year-old military wife named Sarah Mitchell would share the story of her last goodbye with her husband in such heartbreaking, intimate, and devastating detail that Steve would literally walk away from the podium mid-show, unable to continue, leaving the stage for several minutes while he tried to process what he'd just heard. What began as a standard family introduction would transform into one of the most raw and honest accounts of military loss, the final moments before death, and the impossible burden of living with last words that can never be answered. Before we continue with Sarah's account of her last goodbye, if you're moved by these authentic stories about military families, the cost of service that extends to spouses and children, and the weight of final conversations that haunt the living, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These stories honor the families who sacrifice alongside service members and remind us that every fallen soldier leaves behind loved ones carrying unbearable grief. The Mitchell family from Fort Bragg, North Carolina walked onto the Family Feud stage with a subdued energy that immediately stood out. There were 5 of them competing. Sarah, a 33-year-old widow, her mother Patricia, who was 58, her sister Emily, who was 30, her brother-in-law James, who was 32, and Sarah's 8-year-old daughter Lily. What was most striking about the family was Sarah herself. She wore all black, moved with the careful control of someone holding themselves together through sheer willpower, and her eyes held a bottomless grief that was immediately recognizable to anyone who had experienced profound loss. Around her neck hung 2 sets of military dog tags, and she touched them constantly, as though drawing strength or comfort from the metal. During the family introductions, Steve immediately noticed Sarah's visible grief and the protective way her family surrounded her. When he reached Sarah in the lineup, he spoke with unusual gentleness. "Mrs. Mitchell, thank you for being here today with your family. How are you doing?" It was a simple question, but Sarah's response made it clear this wasn't a simple situation. "I'm surviving, Mr. Harvey. That's about all I can say." Her voice was steady but hollow, the voice of someone who had cried so much there were no tears left. Steve, his extensive experience with people telling him this was a woman in deep grief, responded carefully. "Just surviving is enough sometimes. That's all any of us can do on the hard days." Sarah nodded, and Steve was about to move on when she spoke again. "My husband, Captain Daniel Mitchell, was killed in action 6 months ago in Syria. He was 35 years old. We've been married for 11 years. Our daughter Lily," she gestured to the little girl standing quietly beside Patricia, "was 7 when she lost her daddy. I'm here today because Daniel loved this show, and he made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would still live, still do things, still try to find moments of normalcy for Lily. So here we are." The studio fell into immediate, heavy silence. Steve's face showed the impact of Sarah's words, his usual host energy completely replaced by genuine human compassion and sorrow. "Mrs. Mitchell, Sarah, I am so deeply sorry for your loss. Captain Mitchell made the ultimate sacrifice, and I cannot imagine what these past 6 months have been like for you and your daughter." Sarah nodded, acknowledging his words, but her expression remained distant, as though she was barely present in the room. The game proceeded, but it was clear that Sarah was participating on autopilot. Her family members carried most of the gameplay while Sarah stood stiffly, responding when required but clearly not fully engaged. During one break, Steve noticed Sarah standing apart from her family, staring at nothing, her hand clutching the dog tags around her neck. Lily, her daughter, went to her mother and took her hand, and Sarah seemed to come back to the present moment, kneeling down to hug her child tightly. The Mitchell family won their game, though the victory felt hollow given the circumstances, and advanced to fast money. As they prepared for the final round, Steve made a decision based on pure instinct. "Sarah, before we start, I need to ask you something, and please feel free to say no. You mentioned your husband loved this show, that he made you promise to keep living. Would you like to share anything about him? About Captain Mitchell, only if you're comfortable." Sarah looked at Steve for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted. When she spoke, her voice was stronger than it had been before, as though she'd been waiting for someone to ask. "His name was Daniel. He was a Green Beret Special Forces. He did 7 deployments over 12 years, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. He was the best man I've ever known, the best father, the best husband, and he died doing what he believed was right, protecting his team and completing a mission." She paused, her hand going to the dog tags again. "These were Daniel's. He wore them every day of his service. The last time I saw him alive, 3 days before he died, we had 72 hours together during his R&R leave. We knew he was going back to an extremely dangerous mission. We both knew there was a real possibility he wouldn't come home, so we had to say goodbye knowing it might be forever. The studio was completely silent, everyone recognizing they were about to hear something profound and devastating. Steve stood perfectly still, giving Sarah space to share at her own pace. The morning Daniel left, we woke up early. Lily was still asleep. We sat in our kitchen drinking coffee, not saying much because what do you say when you both know this might be the last morning you ever have together? Sarah's voice remained steady, but tears were flowing freely now. Daniel took off these dog tags and put them around my neck. He said, "If something happens to me, I need you to know that every mission, every moment I was away, I was wearing these and thinking about coming home to you. These will remind you that I carried you with me always." I told him not to talk like that he was going to come home like he always did. But he insisted we have the conversation we'd been avoiding. Steve's own eyes were filling with tears, and the audience sat in sorrowful silence, many people crying already. Sarah continued. Daniel said, "Sarah, if I don't make it back, I need you to promise me something. Promise me you won't just survive, you'll live. You'll laugh again, you'll love again someday, you'll give Lily a full life. Promise me you won't let my death define the rest of your life. I'm choosing to serve and to take these risks, but you and Lily don't deserve to pay for my choices by living in perpetual grief." Her voice broke completely. I couldn't promise him that. I told him I couldn't imagine living if he was gone, that I didn't want to think about life without him, that he needed to stop talking like this and just come home safely. But he kept pushing. He said, "Sarah, I need to hear you promise. I need to know that if I die, you and Lily will be okay eventually. That's what will give me peace if something happens." So finally, to give him peace, I promised. I promised I would live, not just survive. I promised I would let Lily have a normal childhood despite losing her father. I promised I would eventually open my heart to the possibility of happiness again. Sarah paused, struggling with what came next. Then Daniel went to say goodbye to Lily. He woke her up gently, carried her downstairs, and they sat on the couch together. I could hear him telling her how much he loved her, how proud he was of her, how she needed to be brave and take care of Mommy if Daddy couldn't come home. Lily, who was 7, told him he was being silly, that of course he'd come home like he always did. And Daniel just held her and cried, which Lily had never seen before. That's when she started to understand this goodbye was different. The studio was completely silent except for the sound of people crying. Steve stood frozen, his hand over his mouth, tears streaming down his face. Sarah pressed on, needing to finish the story. Daniel's last words to me, standing at our front door with his bag packed, were, "I love you more than anything in this world. Thank you for giving me the best 11 years of my life. Thank you for Lily, take care of each other. And remember your promise, live, don't just survive." Then he kissed me and he walked out that door, and 3 days later, 2 Army officers came to my door to tell me he was gone. Sarah's voice dropped to barely a whisper. He was killed by an IED while on a mission to extract a wounded teammate. Daniel was the team medic and the senior officer. When one of his soldiers was hit and pinned down, Daniel ran through enemy fire to get to him, provided medical care under fire, and was killed by a secondary explosion while protecting his wounded teammate. His teammate survived because Daniel died shielding him with his own body. Daniel died exactly the way he lived, putting others first, protecting his team, doing what he believed was right no matter the cost to himself. The devastating conclusion of Sarah's story settled over the studio. She delivered the final, crushing detail. "For 6 months, I have been trying to keep the promise I made to Daniel in our last goodbye. I've been trying to live instead of just survive. But Mr. Harvey, I don't know how. Every morning I wake up and realize all over again that Daniel is gone. Every time Lily asks when Daddy is coming home because she still can't fully process that he's never coming back, I die a little more inside. Every time I touch these dog tags and remember his last words, I feel like I'm failing him because I'm not living. I'm drowning." What happened next would become one of the most discussed moments in Family Feud history. Steve Harvey, a man who had maintained his composure through thousands of emotional moments, simply couldn't continue. Without saying a word, he turned and walked away from the podium, walked past the production crew, and exited the stage completely. The cameras kept rolling, capturing the unprecedented moment of a host literally unable to continue the show because the emotional weight was too heavy to carry while maintaining any semblance of professional composure. The studio sat in shocked silence, unsure what was happening or what to do. Sarah stood at the podium looking lost, as though she'd done something wrong. Her mother Patricia rushed to her side, embracing her daughter while Sarah repeated, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said all that, I ruined the show." Patricia spoke loudly enough for the microphones to catch. "Sarah, honey, you didn't ruin anything. You told the truth about what military families go through. You honored Daniel by sharing your last goodbye with him. There's nothing to apologize for." Backstage, Steve Harvey had completely broken down. A production assistant later described finding him in a hallway, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, sobbing uncontrollably. Steve, when he could speak, kept saying, "That woman is living in a nightmare. Her last goodbye, those last words, the promise she made. How is anyone supposed to live with that? How is anyone that strong?" After nearly 10 minutes, Steve composed himself enough to return to the stage. His face was swollen from crying, his eyes red, his usual polished appearance completely gone. He walked directly to Sarah and simply wrapped his arms around her, holding this grieving widow while they both cried. The audience, which had been silent in uncertainty, rose to their feet in an ovation that wasn't celebratory but was rather a collective acknowledgement of Sarah's pain and courage. When Steve finally found his voice, it was raw and broken. "Sarah, I apologize for walking away. I have never done that in 28 years of hosting this show. But what you just shared, the intimacy of that last goodbye, the promise Daniel made you make, the weight you're carrying trying to honor that promise while drowning in grief. I couldn't process it while standing here pretending to host a game show. I had to step away because you deserve better than someone going through the motions while you're sharing the most painful moment of your life." Sarah, crying herself, responded, "Mr. Harvey, you don't have to apologize. I probably shouldn't have shared all that. I don't know why I did, I think. I think I needed to tell someone outside my family about that last goodbye because I've been carrying it alone for 6 months and it's crushing me." Steve shook his head firmly. "No, Sarah, you absolutely should have shared it. Every word you said needed to be heard. Because there are thousands of military widows and widowers carrying the same burden you are. There are thousands of families who had to say goodbye knowing it might be forever. There are thousands of children who lost parents to war. Your story, Daniel's story, they represent all of those untold stories, and people need to understand what military families really sacrifice." He addressed the cameras and audience directly, his voice thick with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, we talk about supporting our troops. We put yellow ribbons on our cars, and we say thank you for your service. But do we really understand what we're asking of military families?" Sarah said goodbye to her husband knowing he might die. She made a promise in that goodbye that's now torturing her because she's trying to honor her dead husband's wishes while being destroyed by grief. Their daughter said goodbye to her father without understanding it was forever. That's what military families sacrifice. That's what supporting our troops really costs. Eve turned back to Sarah. "You said you're failing Daniel because you're not living, you're drowning. Sarah, you're standing here 6 months after losing your husband. You got out of bed this morning, you're taking care of your daughter. You came on this show because Daniel loved it and you wanted to honor him. You are living. Maybe it doesn't feel like it because you're in the deepest grief, but you're doing it. You're keeping your promise one day at a time." Patricia, Sarah's mother, spoke up, her own voice heavy with emotion. "Mr. Harvey, I want to say something about my son-in-law Daniel and about my daughter. Daniel was an extraordinary man. From the day he and Sarah got married, we knew he was special forces, knew the risks. But Daniel always said that Sarah was stronger than him, that she was the real hero of their family because she handled the deployments, raised Lily often as a single parent, and carried the constant fear of loss without breaking. He said military spouses serve right alongside their soldier, just in different ways." Patricia continued, "When Daniel died, I watched my daughter shatter into pieces. For weeks, she barely functioned. She would sit holding his dog tags and crying for hours. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, could barely take care of Lily. Her grief was so profound I was terrified we'd lose her too. But slowly, day by day, she's been putting herself back together. Not because she wants to, but because she promised Daniel she would. That's love, that's strength, that's keeping faith with a promise made in a last goodbye." Emily, Sarah's sister, added her perspective. "Daniel made Sarah promise to live, but what he was really asking was almost impossible. He was asking her to survive losing the love of her life, to raise their daughter alone, to somehow find happiness again someday, all while carrying the weight of his death and the knowledge that his last words to her were a request for her to be okay without him. That's a crushing burden to place on someone, even though Daniel did it out of love." Sarah spoke up, her voice stronger now. "I don't blame Daniel for making me promise. He needed to know we'd be okay if he died. He needed that peace. But living with that promise is the hardest thing I've ever done. Because every time I laugh at something Lily says, I feel guilty that I'm laughing when Daniel is dead. Every time I have a good day, I feel like I'm betraying his memory. Every time I think about the future, I feel wrong for imagining a life without him in it. But then I remember his last words, live, don't just survive, and I know he didn't want me to spend decades drowning in grief. He wanted better for me and for Lily. Lily, who had been silent throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke up in the clear, honest voice of an 8-year-old. "Mommy, Daddy told me the same thing. When he said goodbye, he said if he didn't come home, I needed to help you be happy again. He said it was my special mission, so we have to try to be happy because Daddy asked us to." The simplicity and wisdom of Lily's words, her child's understanding of her father's wishes, broke something in everyone present. Sarah knelt down and pulled her daughter into a tight embrace, both of them crying. Steve Harvey, watching this exchange, had to turn away again, overcome with emotion. When he composed himself, Steve made several announcements. "Sarah, we're not playing fast money. Your family is receiving the $20,000 regardless because you've already given us something far more valuable, the truth about what military families endure. But beyond that, the Steve Harvey Foundation is establishing the Captain Daniel Mitchell Memorial Fund to support military families, specifically families who have lost a service member. We're starting with $200,000, and we're going to provide grief counseling, financial assistance, educational support for children who have lost parents, and whatever else these families need." Steve continued, "We're also going to make sure that Captain Daniel Mitchell's story, his service, his sacrifice, and his love for his family are properly honored. Sarah, you mentioned Daniel died protecting a teammate. That teammate survived because of Daniel's courage. We're going to track down that soldier and bring you two together so you can meet the person whose life Daniel gave his own to save. You deserve to know that Daniel's death meant someone else got to go home to their family." The audience erupted in the most emotional standing ovation in the show's history, people on their feet crying, applauding not in celebration, but in acknowledgement of unfathomable sacrifice and loss. Veterans in the audience came forward, many of them in tears, to embrace Sarah and thank her for sharing her story and for supporting Daniel through his service. When the episode aired 2 weeks later, during Veterans Day week, it was preceded by extensive content warnings and accompanied by crisis resources for military families, veterans, and anyone struggling with grief. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 48 hours, the clip of Sarah sharing her last goodbye with Daniel had been viewed over 1.2 billion times globally, making it one of the most watched moments in television history. Military families around the world responded with an outpouring of support and recognition. Thousands of military widows and widowers shared their own stories of last goodbyes, final promises, and the impossible burden of living with a loved one's last words. Many expressed gratitude that Sarah had spoken so honestly about the guilt that comes with trying to keep promises to the dead, about the feeling of betraying their memory by experiencing any happiness, and about the crushing weight of grief that doesn't diminish just because you're supposed to support the troops. The Department of Defense released a statement acknowledging that military families make enormous sacrifices and that more needs to be done to support families after a service member's death. The VA expanded its grief counseling services specifically for military families, citing Sarah's story as highlighting gaps in current support systems. Congress held hearings on survivor benefits and support for Gold Star families, with Sarah's testimony about her last goodbye, with Daniel being entered into the congressional record. Mental health professionals specializing in grief praised Sarah's honesty about the complexity of carrying a loved one's final wishes. "Someone dies, their last words can take on almost sacred significance," one grief counselor explained. "But when those last words include requests or promises, as Daniel's did, they can become a source of torment for the survivor. Sarah is trying to honor Daniel by keeping her promise to live, not just survive. But her grief is so profound that any moment of happiness feels like betrayal. This is an incredibly common experience for grieving people, but it's rarely discussed so openly." The soldier whose life Daniel saved by shielding him from the explosion was identified as Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson. Marcus had been hospitalized for months with severe injuries, but had survived. When contacted by the show's producers, Marcus broke down crying and said he would be honored to meet Sarah and Lily to thank them for Daniel's sacrifice and to tell them exactly what kind of hero their husband and father had been. The meeting, which occurred 2 months after the original Family Feud episode aired, was documented for a special on military sacrifice. When Marcus met Sarah for the first time, they both cried as Marcus told her, "Your husband saved my life. He didn't hesitate. He saw I was hit, ran through enemy fire to reach me, provided medical care while under fire, and when that second explosion happened, he threw himself on top of me to shield me." I'm here today, my wife still has her husband, my kids still have their father because Captain Mitchell gave his life for mine. I will carry that debt and that gratitude for the rest of my life. Marcus continued. I've been wrestling with survivor's guilt since the day I woke up in the hospital and learned Captain Mitchell was gone. I feel like it should have been me, that my life isn't worth his, that I should have died instead. But my therapist keeps telling me that the best way to honor Captain Mitchell is to live well, to be the husband and father I'm capable of being, to make his sacrifice mean something. And I realize that's exactly what he asked you to do in your last goodbye. He asked you to live, not just survive. So maybe we can help each other keep that promise to him. Sarah and Marcus's friendship, forged through shared grief and the bond of Daniel's sacrifice, became an important part of both their healing journeys. They attended grief counseling together, supported each other through difficult days, and reminded each other that Daniel had given both of them the gift of life. Marcus literally, Sarah through their years together, and that honoring that gift meant living as fully as possible despite the pain. 1 year after Sarah's appearance on Family Feud, a follow-up special documented the Mitchell family's journey through grief. Sarah shared that while the pain hadn't diminished, she had learned to carry it differently. I'm not sure I'll ever be okay in the way people want me to be, Sarah explained honestly. Daniel's death broke something in me that can't be fixed. But I'm learning that I can be broken and still functioning, still a good mother to Lily, still honoring the promise I made to Daniel in our last goodbye. Sarah continued. I've connected with hundreds of other military widows since sharing my story. We've formed support groups where we can be honest about the darkness, about the guilt, about feeling like we're failing our fallen service members when we're not handling grief correctly. And I've learned that there is no correct way to grieve. Some days I'm okay, some days I'm destroyed, and both of those are valid responses to losing the love of my life. Lily, now 9 years old, shared her own perspective with remarkable maturity. I miss my daddy every single day. I wish he was here to teach me things and watch me grow up. But I know he died being a hero, saving his friend Mr. Marcus. And I know Daddy's special mission for me was to help Mommy be happy again, so I try to make her smile every day. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but I keep trying because that's what Daddy asked me to do. The Captain Daniel Mitchell Memorial Fund had grown to over $30 million within the first year, providing comprehensive support to hundreds of Gold Star families. The fund provided grief counseling, financial assistance, educational scholarships for children who lost parents in service, and specialized support for families navigating the unique challenges of military loss. Sarah became actively involved in the fund, using her story to raise awareness and providing peer support to newly widowed military spouses. 3 years after Daniel's death, Sarah shared a significant milestone in her healing. I went on my first date since losing Daniel, she admitted during an interview. It felt terrifying and wrong and like a betrayal all at once. But I remembered Daniel's last words to me, his insistence that I should eventually open my heart to the possibility of love again. I don't know if this will lead anywhere, but I'm trying to honor Daniel by living, by staying open to the possibility of happiness, by not closing off my heart permanently because I lost him. Sarah continued. I think Daniel understood something I didn't when we said goodbye. That love doesn't end with death, but life continues. He wanted me to have a full life, even if he couldn't be part of it. That was his final gift to me, permission to eventually move forward without guilt. I'm trying to accept that gift, as painful as it is, because keeping my promise to him is how I show that his love for me was real and lasting. The long-term impact of Sarah's sharing her last goodbye with Daniel extended far beyond her individual story. Military families around the world reported feeling less alone in their grief. The stigma around military widows eventually dating or remarrying began to diminish as people recognized that loving again doesn't erase or diminish the love for the fallen service member. Support systems for Gold Star families improved as awareness grew about the unique challenges they face. Perhaps most significantly, Sarah's story changed how civilians thought about what they ask of military families when they support military action. Supporting our troops means understanding what we're asking them to sacrifice, Sarah said in a speech to Congress. It means understanding that every service member who deploys leaves behind a family who says goodbye not knowing if it's forever. It means providing comprehensive support for those families when the worst happens. And it means honoring the fallen not just with words and ceremonies, but with genuine care for the families they left behind. If Sarah Mitchell's account of her last goodbye with her husband, Captain Daniel Mitchell, the promise he made her make, and her struggle to keep that promise while drowning in grief has moved you, deepened your understanding of military sacrifice, or reminded you that supporting our troops means supporting their families, please take a moment now to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with anyone who needs to understand the real cost of military service, with military families who might be struggling in silence, and with people who make decisions about military deployment and veteran family support. Sarah's courage in sharing the most painful and intimate moment of her life, Steve Harvey's honest response that broke through his professional composure, and the subsequent awareness and support for Gold Star families have impacted millions and provided resources for families navigating the unimaginable pain of losing a service member. Your engagement helps ensure this powerful message reaches more people who need to understand that every fallen soldier leaves behind a family whose grief and sacrifice deserve our enduring support. The story of Sarah Mitchell sharing her last goodbye with her husband Daniel, the promise he made her make to live rather than just survive, and her devastating honesty about how impossible that promise feels to keep stands as one of the most raw and emotionally powerful moments ever captured on television. Daniel's final words asking Sarah to promise she would eventually find happiness again, spoken in a goodbye both of them knew might be their last, revealed the depth of love that compels someone to think about their spouse's future even while facing their own possible death. Sarah's admission that she's been drowning while trying to keep that promise, that every moment of happiness feels like betrayal, that she's failing the husband she lost, laid bare the impossible burden that surviving family members carry when their loved one's last words become a mandate for how to live. Steve Harvey's unprecedented decision to simply walk away from the stage, because the weight of Sarah's story was too heavy to carry, while maintaining professional composure, demonstrated that some grief transcends performance and demands authentic human response. Sarah's story honors not just Daniel's sacrifice, but the sacrifice of every military family who says goodbye not knowing if it's forever, who makes promises in last moments that haunt them for years, and who tries to rebuild shattered lives while honoring the wishes of the dead. That is a sacrifice our nation must recognize, support, and never take for granted.